Lambeau Field,
Fenway Park,
the Rose Bowl, the athletic venues that stand as great monuments and landmarks in our sports landscape. This hour on Yahoo Sports Radio, we take you from coast to coast to the most famous stadiums and arenas in all of sports. Stadiums USA Radio.
In-depth conversation focusing on the popular venues across the sports globe, from the pros to the minor leagues to college.
The latest news in stadium design, renovations, and stadium connections to their communities. Your host, Bill Hazen, talks with athletes, coaches, authors, and newsmakers who share their experiences and connections to the most storied structures and stadiums in all of sports.
The conversation is now.
Broadcasting from Stadiums USA headquarters in Chicago, here's the man who was behind the mic detailing Michael Jordan's entry into the NBA. And now, he is your official stadium guide with your ticket to the latest stadium news and information. Here he is, Bill Hazen.
Through many weeks of doing this program, I have discovered that there are a number of people who have a love for Shea Stadium in New York. And of course, this was the home field. We probably know it best as the home field of the New York Mets, and also in pro football for a considerable period of time, the New York Jets. But actually, it housed a lot more than that, and there are a lot of fans who just love this stadium and love going and seeing events there. One of them is the author of a wonderful book. Brett Topel has written When Shea Was Home, and he's talking about, and it's a very interesting story, how Shea was home, not just for those two teams I mentioned, but also for the Yankees and also for the New York Giants, all at the same time. And that is the focus of this wonderful book. Brett, it's great to welcome you to the program. Let's start from the beginning on this thing. What were the circumstances that made it possible for four teams to be playing simultaneously on this one field?
Absolutely, Bill. First of all, let me just say thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Well, yes, 1975 was about the oddest season that New York City sports could have imagined. The Mets and the Jets, as you mentioned, called Shea Stadium home since 1964 when it opened. Yankee Stadium was going through a serious reconstruction, and they were ripping it apart and building a new Yankee Stadium. They didn't tear the structure down, but the Yankees were displaced for both the 1974 and 1975 seasons. So by the time 1975 rolled around, the Yankees had already experienced 1 year at Shea Stadium. It wasn't their favorite place, but they knew going in they would be there for 2 years. Things got really crazy when, before the 1975 season started, the New York Giants decided that they would come back and play 1 year at Shea Stadium. They had been displaced also, like the Yankees. They had gone up to Connecticut and played at the Yale Bowl for 2 seasons, 73 and 74. Were miserable there. New mayor of New York City, Abe Beame, was friendly with Wellington Mara, the owner of the Giants at the time, and invited him to play at Shea Stadium while they were waiting for Giants Stadium in New Jersey to be ready. The Giants accepted, and for that one crazy year, the Mets, Yankees, Jets, and Giants all called Shea home.
Let me ask you, when did you figure out that this would make interesting reading, that it might make a great topic for a book?
Sure, that's a great question, and I actually deal with this in the preface of the book. I had an idea that I wanted to write something about Shea Stadium. I always had wanted to write something about Shea Stadium. It was a stadium that I grew up going to with my dad, watching the Mets from the early 70s on, and I always wanted to do something there. So when I came across this story that I knew about but had not really read much about, I decided that I had to reconfirm that it was really a story that needed to be told. And I had a very bizarre encounter at Citi Field, which is the current home of the Mets, of course, where the Hall of Fame groundskeeper, Pete Flynn, who makes a lot of appearances in my book, he was a head groundskeeper at Shea Stadium since 1974 and was the man in charge of keeping the field playable in 75. But this was in 2012, and I was at Citi Field, and it was a kind of bizarre circumstances, but I ended up bumping into Pete Flynn, and I wanted to say to him, I wanted to say something to him and see what he thought about this idea. So I approached him and said, Mr. Flynn, my name is Brett Topel, and I'm an author, and I'm thinking about writing a book about the 75 season in Shea. And Pete looked away from me, kind of looked longingly towards the infield and said, that season be the death of me in his real Irish brogue. And that's pretty much when he said that, that's when I knew I had to write this book.
Yeah, it's a great story. You know, I'm sure you learned through the process of writing a book just how much research, how much work actually goes into it. How did you source out the various things that you learned about the stadium? Where did it all come from?
I wasn't sure when I started out this process who I would be able to speak to as far as first-person sources, and I was really very lucky. I got to speak to some great people. Marty Appel, who is an award-winning author himself, was the PR director for the Yankees in 1975. I had a nice long talk with him. Pete Flynn, of course, after my initial encounter with him, we exchanged contact information, and the very next day, this is going back now in 2012, we had a long talk where Pete told me all of the weirdness of Shea Stadium that year. It didn't even have a sprinkler system. They used to water it by hand every single day. And I spoke to, people, Bill Verdon, who was manager of the Yankees at the time. And really, I got to speak to some co-owner of the Giants, John Mara, Wellington's son. Rich Castor of the Jets was Joe Namath's tight end that year. I was so really blessed to be able to talk to so many first-person sources who not only remembered but experienced that year at Shea Stadium.
We're telling the story of the 1975 season at Shea Stadium, where forces brought 4 professional teams together to play on the same surface. Brett Topel has written When Shea Was Home. Brett, let's get into the turf management. You referred to it. That seems to be, I would say, probably the biggest story, because certainly Shea Stadium was a very competent stadium, as well designed and good for several types of events in there. You had parking, you had access, you had everything you needed. So, but how much could that turf actually take?
Well, you're absolutely correct, Bill. I mean, Shea was one of those stadiums that was built to be a multi-purpose stadium. It was built for the 1964 World's Fair. There was no question that it was going to be the home to the Mets and the Jets. And like you said, plenty of parking, plenty of concession stands. They had, NFL locker rooms in addition to Major League Baseball locker rooms. So they weren't sharing facilities. However, when 4 teams got in there, obviously things changed a bit. And as you said, the field conditions took a terrible toll. And, I mentioned Pete Flynn earlier, and he's not in the Groundskeepers Hall of Fame for nothing. He certainly earned his spot there. He had been with the Mets grounds crew since 1962, worked for the great Johnny McCarthy, who was the head groundskeeper early on in the Met days, and he took over, Pete did, in 1974, just in time for all this craziness. And in addition to telling me things such as that Shea did not have an in-ground sprinkler system back in 1975. They took big fire hoses and had to water the outfield grass and the infield grass by hand every single day, some days multiple times a day. As you know, Shea Stadium was a huge, expansive outfield, and it was where fly balls really went to die in those alleys. And, Marty Appel, who is the author himself of Pinstripe Empire and Munson, the Thurman Munson biography, very, very great, 2 great books. And he was the PR director there for the Yankees, and he said, it was a very different time because all of the outfielders, for the most part, were chewing tobacco and spitting it in different spots of the outfield, which was killing off the outfield grass. So if it wasn't enough to have, this double amount of baseball and then eventually double amount of football, there were other forces that were killing off the grass. And Pete Flynn was very honest with me. He said, listen, by the end of the football season, there was not a blade of grass in the place. When it rained a lot, Shea Stadium's outfield grass got very swampy. In fact, Elliot Maddox, who was a young star for the Yankees in 75, had a terrible injury. He fell on the wet grass in Shea Stadium's outfield and hurt his knee and was never the same. And when it was dry, like you said, it was becoming very brittle. And by the time they were midway through the football season, and there are a decent amount of highlights where you can watch Joe Namath trying to maneuver around these giant chunks of what was, I guess, infield grass at the time, and he was sort of like a golfer replacing his divots, but there was really not much you can do. And, to make matters worse, if it wasn't enough having those 4 teams there, Shea Stadium also hosted things such as the New York City high school baseball championships that year. It hosted a Grambling football game with the great Doug Williams at quarterback that year. So even on its days off, so to speak, it didn't have days off.
The Mets and the Jets were the primary tenants, of course. So the Yankees and the Giants were playing there because obviously they had work going on in stadiums and thus didn't have a place to play. How did those two teams react respectively to also playing at Shea Stadium?
I think for the Yankees and the Giants, to an extent, it was an end. It was an end to justify the means. They knew that they were going to have these beautiful new stadiums. In the Yankees' case, a really completely reconstructed Yankee Stadium, and in the Giants' case, they were just going to be a season away from this beautiful facility in the Meadowlands in New Jersey. One of the things that was not hard. None of the four teams was particularly good. The Yankees and Mets were okay. They were above 500 teams, but the Jets and the Giants were absolutely miserable. I think they were less thinking about what was going on in the field and more thinking about what would happen when they left Shea Stadium. And for the Yankees, it was, they left Shea Stadium after 75, went on to win the pennant 3 years in a row and 2 world championships. And of course, the Giants took a lot longer to get respectable. But I don't think the Yankees and Giants particularly look back on those times, glowingly. Certainly the people I spoke to didn't really have much nice things to say about the stadium, but I think they also looked at it as more of just a weird part of life.
When I was a kid growing up, I would listen to the broadcasts of visiting teams that went into Shea Stadium. They all had one thing in common. You could hear those Jets going in and out of LaGuardia all the time. That was probably one of the real principal problems. How did everybody get used to that?
It's funny. I don't think the visiting teams ever got used to it. As fans when I started going, like I said, 40 plus years ago, it just part of going to baseball games. And because that upper deck was as high as I mentioned, it felt like you could reach out and touch those Jets as they buzzed by. And there were days, depending on the weather, that they literally would come right over the stadium. And some players, Keith Hernandez in the 80s always would step out of the batter's box when the Jet would come over, and because he didn't want to be distracted. He was, a very cerebral hitter. But some players just let it go. And I think it was almost like a home field advantage for the Mets. They were expecting it, and it always kind of bugged the visiting players.
As the successor to Shea Stadium, how has Citi Field worked out?
It's a very interesting question, because I think the first, if you would have asked me that 1 or 2 years even into Citi Field, I would have said, I'm not really sure how it's worked out, because initially there wasn't a real connection to the Mets or to Mets history in that stadium. The owners of the Mets were kind of built the stadium as an homage to the Brooklyn Dodgers. In fact, the rotunda of Citi Field looks a lot like Ebbets Field used to look, and the rotunda is called Jackie Robinson Rotunda and is surrounded by all Jackie Robinson memorabilia. And that kind of bugged Met fans the first year or so, because it wasn't a Dodgers stadium. It was a Mets, the Mets stadium, the home of the Mets. And the outfield wall was painted in black and orange numbers similar to Polo Grounds. So they were spending a lot of money and a lot of time honoring teams other than the Mets. And I have to tell you, the last 4, 5, 6 years, Citi Field has truly become home to the Mets. And I think it's someplace that really all Met fans who go, it feels like their stadium, and it doesn't hurt that they're a good team now, right? You win a pennant, and all of a sudden your stadium is really your stadium. But they've done a tremendous job making Citi Field become the home field of the New York Mets. And I think it's still nice, and one of the things they did, which I'm really grateful they did, was, in the parking lot where Shea Stadium was, there is a plaque where home plate was. There is a plaque where the pitcher's mound was, and first, second, and third base. So when I take my son or daughter to the game, I make sure we always stop by Shea Stadium just to say hi before we check in for a Met game.
When Shea Was Home, a great book, a good read. Brett, how do they get it?
Well, they can get it in a number of ways. It's online, on sale for all the online retailers, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. It's available in some stores. I'm not sure if it's available in stores nationwide. It's certainly available in stores in the New York area. But all online booksellers, there's a Kindle version available, so you can read it on your device if you'd like. But any way you usually get books, you should be able to get When Shea Was Home.
Well, Brett, we wish you well. Sell a bunch of them, will you? Have some fun with this book now that you've done it, and it's a great, great read and a great story to tell. When Shea Was Home. Brett Topel, thank you so much for the visit.
Bill, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Lambeau Field,
Fenway Park,
the Rose Bowl, the athletic venues that stand as great monuments and landmarks in our sports landscape. This hour on Yahoo Sports Radio, we take you from coast to coast to the most famous stadiums and arenas in all of sports. Stadiums USA Radio.
In-depth conversation focusing on the popular venues across the sports globe, from the pros to the minor leagues to college.
The latest news in stadium design, renovations, and stadium connections to their communities. Your host, Bill Hazen, talks with athletes, coaches, authors, and newsmakers who share their experiences and connections to the most storied structures and stadiums in all of sports.
The conversation is now.
Broadcasting from Stadiums USA headquarters in Chicago, here's the man who was behind the mic, detailing Michael Jordan's entry into the NBA. And now, he is your official stadium guide, with your ticket to the latest stadium news and information. Here he is, Bill Hazen.
Through many weeks of doing this program, I have discovered that there are a number of people who have a love for Shea Stadium in New York. And of course, this was the home field. We probably know it best as the home field of the New York Mets, and also in pro football for a considerable period of time, the New York Jets. But actually, it housed a lot more than that, and there are a lot of fans who just love this stadium and love going and seeing events there. One of them is the author of a wonderful book. Brett Topel has written When Shea Was Home, and he's talking about, and it's a very interesting story, how Shea was home, not just for those two teams I mentioned, but also for the Yankees.